Welcome back. Now, before we go deep into actual error handling, let's first write a handler for undefined routes. So basically for routes that we didn't assign any handler yet. And first up, we need to start our application here, which we didn't quit after the recent debugging session. So npm start. And so let's wait for the database connection. Here it is. And so let's now go to Postman here and try to hit a route that we didn't yet define. So I'm just going to go ahead, copy this URL here. All right. And so, for example, let's say that instead of API v1 tours, we would say just API/tours. Okay. So in that case, we would get this HTML result. All right. So Express automatically sends this HTML code here along with a 404 not found error code in case that there is not any handler for the route that was requested. Okay? Or we could also simply misspell tour here, for example. So for example, in this case, we would still get the same error. Now there's also another situation, which is if here after tours we specify something else. Let's say just something like this. And so let's take a look at the error that we get. And so now we get that the cast to object ID failed. And that's because we actually have a route that accepts an ID parameter here after the tour /, right? And so MongoDB is basically trying to find a document with this ID, but cannot convert it to a valid MongoDB object ID, all right? So again, that is a different situation. Let's just keep working with this one. So again, where we get this error, but in this HTML form. Now, since we're doing an API here, it doesn't make much sense to send back HTML, right? And so let's now fix this and basically create a handler function for all the routes that are not catched by our routers. Okay, so let's go back to our application here and open up app.js. Okay, so that's basically the definition of our Express application. Now, before doing anything else, let's actually get rid of this middleware here that we do no longer need. So we just use this here in order to demonstrate the concept of middleware. And so at this point, we no longer need that. All right. Now, how are we going to implement a route handler for a route that was not catched by any of our other route handlers? So for doing that, remember that all these middleware functions are executed in the order they are in the code. And so the idea is that if we have a request that makes it into this point here of our code, then it means that neither the tour router nor the user router were able to catch it. Okay? And so if we add a middleware here after these routers, it will only be reached, again, if not handled by any of our other routers. Okay? So let's do that and then really understand how it works after it's already implemented. So we're going to implement a route handler, and so we say app dot and now the HTTP method for which we want to specify the route. Now we could use get here, right? So just like we did before, but then what about post requests or delete or patch requests? We would then have to write handlers for these as well, and we don't want that. We simply want to handle all the routes, so all the URLs for all the verbs right here in this one handler. Okay? And so in Express, we can use app.all. And so that's then going to run for all the verbs, so all the HTTP methods. All right? Next up, we specify the URL. And since here we want to handle all the URLs that were not handled before, we can use the star here, which is going to stand for everything. All right? And then the rest is just a regular middleware function, just like before. So request, response, and next. Okay, and what do we want to do here? Well, we simply want to send back a response in the JSON format, so not the HTML that we have right now. So rest.status, and here let's set a 404, so not found, and then a JSON response. So just like the usual one, where we set the status to fail. So just a regular JSON formatted response. And then some kind of message here. And actually, let's do a template string here because I want to put a variable in there. So canned find, and then we can use rec dot original URL. Okay, so that's a property that we have on the request, which is, as the name says, the URL that was requested. All right, so this new response that we're going to send back now is a lot better than the HTML that we were receiving previously. So let's now test that out. And indeed, now we get a JSON error message back here. And so here we also get the URL that was requested, and indeed, it's the one that we tried to access, but it is not available. All right, great. Now, again, why did this work? So again, the idea is that if we are able to reach this point here, then it means that the request-response cycle was not yet finished at this point in our code, right? Because remember that middleware is added to the middleware stack in the order that it's defined here in our code. And so basically this code here runs first. And so if the route was matched here in our to router, then our request would never even reach this code, and so then this would not get executed. And so this should basically be the last part after all our other routes, all right? And if I were, just to try this out, now put this right at the top of our application, then you will see that no matter what request we're going to do, we will always get this same response, right? So let's test that. And indeed, now we get this error message. And so that's because our request now reached this route handler here, and it's actually matched because it's a GET request, which is part of all the verbs, right? And then all of the routes, so all of the URLs are catched here. And so, of course, it handles that URL that we just did here. And the same, of course, for example, for a delete tour. So the same thing would happen. We would always get the same response. All right? So let's, of course, put it back. But this was just to demonstrate how and why this works. All right? Great. So this is an important part to make our API a bit more user-friendly. But next up, let's now start learning about real error handling.